On a cold gray morning in December of 2002, 26-year-old Lydia Fairchild stepped out of her modest apartment in Richland, Washington. Her thick reddish-brown hair was tied back in a ponytail, and there were dark circles under her blue eyes. Lydia had not slept much the night before because there was a lot on her mind. She and her longtime boyfriend, Jamie Townsend, had just broken up again. Their relationship had been through many ups and downs over the last several years. They loved each other, but lately they just couldn't seem to get along, and so they had finally decided to just end things. It was a tough situation, especially because they shared 2 kids, a 2-year-old boy and a 1-year-old girl. And things had become even more complicated because Lydia had recently found out that she was pregnant again. Lydia walked off the front steps and headed to her car, trying her best to ignore her overflowing mailbox. She didn't need to look at what was in her mailbox to know it was a whole bunch of bills that were all past due. The bills were another reminder of how challenging life had become lately. She was newly single, pregnant, and also unemployed. While Richland, Washington was a comfortable and safe place to call home, trying to find a job there had been a struggle for Lydia, and her savings were now running low. But she did have one thing she was counting on to keep her going. Several weeks ago, she'd applied for welfare benefits, and this morning, she finally got a phone call about her application. Lydia thought everything had been approved, but the person who called her said there was a problem and she would have to come down to the office to talk about it. And so that was where she was going this morning. So Lydia got into her car and she drove to the social services department a few miles away. Meanwhile, the social worker who had called Lydia waited for her in his office. Sitting next to him was his colleague, a woman dressed in a conservative dark blue suit. Neither of them said very much. They were too focused on studying Lydia's case file. The two of them had seen hundreds of welfare applications over the past few years, but never one like Lydia's, and so they were very curious to see what she would have to say. A few minutes later, there was a knock on the door and Lydia entered. Once she sat down, the social worker who had called her got right to the point. There was a problem with the DNA tests that Lydia and her kids had submitted in order to receive these welfare benefits. The results showed that Lydia was not actually the children's mother. For a long moment, Lydia didn't say anything. Then she let out an awkward laugh and told them there had to be some mistake. But the social worker shook his head. DNA testing had a 100% accuracy rate. Lydia just sat back in her chair with this look of total disbelief in her eyes. And it was at this point the social worker's colleague, who was dressed in the dark blue suit, finally spoke up and introduced herself. She told Lydia she was not a social worker, she was a lawyer, and she was with the prosecutor's office. The lawyer got right to the point. Lydia had clearly committed welfare fraud. She had claimed children that were not hers as dependents on her welfare application, and this was a serious crime. And so the lawyer asked Lydia point blank if she was trying to pass these kids off as her own in order to collect a higher welfare payment. And Lydia said no, of course not. Then the lawyer suggested that Lydia must have stolen someone's identity, but Lydia immediately pulled out her driver's license, which had her name on it and all of the information she had included on her application, and Lydia promised the license was real. Lydia insisted that her kids were her natural-born children. She claimed she even had proof since she had their birth certificates and the baby's footprints from the hospital. The lawyer flashed a worried look over at the social worker. Technically, they both knew it was possible that Lydia could have given birth to these kids without actually sharing their DNA, but that could only happen if she was a surrogate mother. And the social worker realized that if that was the case, that could open up a whole other set of very dark possibilities. Lydia could have been paid to be a surrogate, and then when she actually delivered the kids, she could have kidnapped them from their real mother. If that was the case, this situation could go beyond welfare fraud. The real mother could be out there somewhere desperately looking for her kids. Or even worse, perhaps the mother was harmed. The social worker cleared his mind and tried to stay objective. Lydia's horrified reaction to all of their questions made it hard to believe that she was some hardened criminal. But the best scammers could be great actors, and in his career, the social worker had seen plenty of criminals put on Oscar-worthy performances. Finally, after Lydia continued to deny that she had done anything wrong, the social worker and the lawyer told her that she was free to go. But as she gathered her things, the woman from the prosecutor's office gave her a dire warning. Prosecutors were preparing a criminal case against her, and they could take her kids at any moment. Lydia's hands were shaking as she drove home from the interview. She didn't know what to think. All she knew was that she had to get home and figure out what to do next. Lydia rushed through the front door of her apartment and called her mother, Carol. Carol tried her best to calm Lydia down, reminding her that the stress would not be good for her current pregnancy. Lydia promised she would try to relax, and admittedly, it did make her feel better just to talk to her mom. After they hung up, Lydia took a deep, calming breath and then started looking for evidence that could help prove her side of the story. She dug up the children's medical records and birth certificates. She grabbed photos of her with the babies. Then she set it all aside to present to the prosecutor. She was sure it would convince the authorities that she really was the real mother. The next day, about 600 miles away, inside of a prison in Montana, an inmate was lying on his bunk bed. The gray-haired 50-year-old man looked up when he heard the familiar sound of a guard rapping on the bars. The guard told him that someone named Carol was calling him. The inmate's name was Rod Fairchild, and he was Lydia's father. Carol was Lydia's mom and Rod's ex-wife. If she was calling, Rod knew it meant something was wrong. Rod sat up and followed the guard to the prison's call center. The moment he picked up the receiver, he could tell that Carol was very upset. She told him everything that was happening to Lydia, that she was in trouble over a DNA test and was now being accused of committing welfare fraud. Rod told her to stay calm and that he was sure there must have been some mistake, and he was positive it would all get cleared up soon. But after the call ended, Rod dropped the optimism he had shared with Carol. As he headed back to his cell, he couldn't help but think about the DNA evidence. He wanted to believe his daughter, but he knew DNA didn't lie. And if she tried to fight DNA evidence in court, he was afraid she would lose. As her father, Rod felt terrible about the whole situation, and he even felt a little bit guilty. After all, he was serving time for business fraud, and now his daughter was in trouble over welfare fraud, and so he knew he had not set a great example for his child. Either way, Rod wondered if his daughter had gotten herself into trouble and was now trying to cover it up. The following week, the prosecutor, who was now in charge of Lydia's case, was busy building a case against her. He had to be absolutely certain that there had not been an error with Lydia's DNA test. Although it was highly unlikely, Lydia's samples could have been accidentally switched with someone else's, or maybe they had been tainted somehow. So just to be safe, he ordered Lydia and her kids to come in and submit 3 more DNA samples for testing. It took a few months to process the tests, but sometime around March of 2003, the prosecutor had his answer, and it was exactly what he expected. The prosecutor phoned Lydia to tell her the results. According to this second round of testing, Lydia was still not the children's biological mother. Lydia insisted these results were wrong too, and she began to argue with the prosecutor. She asked if the authorities had seen the birth certificates, the baby footprints, and all the photos of her with the kids. The prosecutor told Lydia that yes, they'd seen them, but it didn't matter. Nobody was denying that she gave birth to the kids. They're denying that they are her kids. At this point, the authorities were convinced that Lydia was running some sort of surrogacy scam. With the newest rounds of DNA tests in their hands, they had everything they needed to convict Lydia. The prosecutor informed her she'd be receiving a court summons and advised her to hire a lawyer. Lydia hung up from the prosecutor in a total daze. She knew she was in deep trouble. Lydia didn't have any time to waste, so she pulled out a phone book and started going through the yellow pages looking for family law attorneys. She explained her situation to each one, but they all said the same thing. There was no sense in fighting DNA evidence, and so none of the lawyers she contacted would agree to represent her. They knew they would lose. By the end of April, when Lydia was 8 months pregnant, she was a total nervous wreck and basically wasn't eating. She had to borrow money since she never got her welfare benefits, and she couldn't get a job because of all the legal trouble she was in. Her first hearing was in a few weeks, on May 16, 2003, and somehow she'd have to argue her case in front of a judge without a lawyer. On May 16, 2003, Lydia's case went to court. This was a preliminary hearing to determine what would happen to her kids while her case proceeded. The judge overseeing the hearing sat in his chambers, reviewing the evidence against Lydia. He thought it was the strangest case he'd ever seen. The prosecution wanted to put her son and daughter in foster care, and it was now up to him, the judge, to decide. He put on his robe and walked into the courtroom, curious to meet the mother. Lydia, who was now 9 months pregnant, struggled to stand up when the judge entered the courtroom. When the judge sat down, he took a closer look at Lydia. She looked ready to give birth at any moment. The judge asked Lydia when she was due, and she told him she was scheduled to be induced into labor in just 3 days. The judge thought about this. Taking the kids away from her at this point, even if they were not technically her kids, seemed unnecessarily cruel. And so he told Lydia that he was prepared to let her keep custody of the kids for the moment, but he had conditions. He needed her and the newborn baby to submit a fresh round of DNA samples. A court officer would literally be present for the birth of this third kid, and the second that baby was born, they would take its DNA to be tested. The following Monday, May 19, 2003, Lydia checked into the hospital. She was induced into labor, and sure enough, the court officer who was in the room witnessed her give birth to a baby boy, who Lydia named Jamie II after her former boyfriend and the father of the baby. As nurses huddled around the newborn, the court officer tapped a lab technician on the shoulder. Before Lydia could hold little Jamie for the first time, the tech drew a vial of blood from the baby. He handed the vial to the court officer, who promptly turned and headed for the door. Before the officer left the room, she looked back for a moment. As Lydia now cuddled with her newborn son for the first time, it was hard for the court officer to believe that this woman was anything but a genuine loving mother. The officer looked down at the vial in her hand. It would prove whether Lydia was this baby's biological mother, or if she was really the scheming liar that prosecutors claimed she was. 2 weeks later, the results from Lydia and her new baby's blood tests came back. It showed that, once again, she and her child did not share any DNA, so she could not be the baby's biological mother. Prosecutors were more sure than ever that Lydia was in fact running some kind of surrogacy scam. Now Lydia was in even bigger trouble than before. And without a lawyer, she ran an even bigger risk of losing her case. Just a few days after Lydia's newest DNA results came back showing she was not the biological mother of her newest baby, a 41-year-old attorney named Alan Tyndall sat down at his cluttered desk with his morning coffee. He had a stack of paperwork that he was not looking forward to doing that day, so when his secretary patched through a potential client, he was happy to take the call. It was Lydia, and as Alan listened to her story, he wasn't sure what to make of her. Like any good lawyer, he knew DNA evidence was the gold standard. But Alan enjoyed a challenge. He was a proud military veteran and former public defender. He was used to taking on tough situations. Alan was especially curious about Lydia's most recent DNA test. To his knowledge, the only way a woman could give birth to a baby that was not hers was if she was a surrogate. But Lydia said she wasn't, and this child and the other two were really her biological children. Alan had never heard of someone successfully overturning DNA evidence, but he believed everyone had a right to legal representation, and somehow he believed that Lydia had to be telling the truth. And so he told her he would take her case. With Lydia's next court date looming, Alan got straight to work. He spent long nights at his office looking for any logical way to defend her, but he kept arriving at the same conclusion, There was no fighting DNA evidence. After several weeks, Alan was still no closer to finding a way to defend Lydia, until one morning, his secretary brought him a recent edition of the New England Journal of Medicine. It came with a note from a colleague. There was an article they thought could be relevant to Lydia's case. At first, Alan shrugged it off. Lydia's case was starting to make the local news because it was so unusual, and so as a result, Alan had been getting a lot of unsolicited advice from people who had seen her story on the news. But Alan was not making much progress on his own, so he picked up the thick journal and started to flip through it. And by the time he got to the end, his eyes were wide. He could not believe what he had just read. It was a long shot, but if what he had read was true, it could be the key to winning this impossible case. Alan's first step was to convince the judge to postpone the trial. He explained that Lydia needed to undergo more in-depth testing to try out this new theory he had, and it could take months to get the results. The judge agreed to delay the court date until April of 2004, nearly a year away. Alan was confident that would give them enough time. And so right away, he sent Lydia off to lab after lab where she underwent a battery of tests. Then they waited. Almost a year went by, and Alan was still waiting for the results, and the date for Lydia's hearing was fast approaching. One night, Alan was in his office working on his opening statement for Lydia's case when his phone rang. It was the doctor overseeing Lydia's lab work, and he told Alan he had some bad news. There was still too much data to analyze, and Lydia's test results wouldn't be ready in time for her hearing. Alan could not hide his disappointment. This was a huge setback, but he knew the judge wouldn't delay the trial any longer. And so, in April of 2004, Alan and Lydia walked into the courthouse where her trial would finally take place. Once they were seated, Alan leaned over to reassure her. Then he stood up and faced the judge. Alan didn't have the science-based evidence that he'd been counting on this whole time. What he had instead was a very strange story to tell, and everything in the whole case came down to whether he could get the judge to believe it. He began to explain why a schoolteacher who lived 3,000 miles away in Boston, Massachusetts, and who had never met or even heard of Lydia, could prove his client was innocent. That schoolteacher's name was Karen Keegan, and in the late 1990s, Karen was sick and needed a kidney transplant. Hoping her sons would be a match, they all took a DNA test. And just like Lydia, the results showed there was a 0% chance that Karen was the mother of her kids. But unlike Lydia, Karen was able to find out why. A Harvard doctor looked into her case and suggested an extremely bizarre scenario. Karen was something called a human chimera. This condition was named after a creature from Greek mythology who had a lion's head, a goat's body, and a serpent's tail. So basically, it was several different animals rolled into one. When a woman conceives twins, it's because 2 eggs in her womb have been fertilized. On extremely rare occasions, the 2 eggs then fuse a few days after fertilization, and when that happens, the resulting embryo becomes one fetus with 2 different genetic codes. This is a human chimera. And once it's born, different parts of its body have unique strands of DNA. That explained why Karen Keegan didn't come up as a genetic match for both of her sons. The sample they had tested came from her other set of DNA. But then they tested different parts of Karen's body, her hair, her skin, even her bladder, and eventually they found DNA that did match her sons, and it came from Karen's thyroid gland. Alan argued that Lydia had to be a chimera too. Essentially, he was telling the judge that Lydia was her own twin. And because of this, samples may have been taken from a part of Lydia's body that had a different set of DNA than her kids. Unfortunately, they still had not found any tissue within Lydia that matched her kids' DNA yet. But they did have something. Alan had gotten Lydia's mom tested, and that test proved that at least she, the mother, shared DNA with Lydia's children. That meant either Lydia or Lydia's sister had to be the kid's mother. The judge took a moment to digest the evidence. If all his years on the bench taught him one thing, it was that DNA tests were always right. But Alan's argument was very compelling. Then the judge made his announcement. He told the court he believed Lydia Fairchild was indeed the mother of these kids. In his opinion, the story of Karen Keegan, paired with the new DNA results of Lydia's mother, proved that Lydia had to be a human chimera. And so the judge dismissed Lydia's case and admitted that he was wrong. After almost 2 years, Lydia's ordeal was finally over. She burst into tears as Alan put his arm around her. She had been telling the truth, as crazy as it sounded, the whole time. A few months later, doctors were able to finally show that Lydia's DNA did match her kids. They found the matching DNA from a cervical smear. Lydia Fairchild went down in textbooks as only one of 100 human chimeras ever identified. And while her ordeal would forever haunt her, it did bring her family closer together than they ever had been before. Lydia and her ex-boyfriend, Jamie Townsend, did get back together long enough to have a 4th child. This time around, because the world knew that Lydia was a human chimera, nobody questioned if she was the mother. Maria Gonzalez would be very relieved when her employers got back from their vacation in Europe. The 58-year-old live-in maid and all-around family companion looked up at the big house in the heart of Houston, Texas, where she had been employed for the last 5 years, ever since September of 1977. Maria's friendly brown eyes softened at the sight of the 2 little boys watching her from a downstairs window as she walked back into the mansion on Memorial Drive, carrying the morning newspaper. The paper was in English, so Maria, whose first language was Spanish, hardly gave it a glance before placing it neatly on top of the growing pile of newspapers in the home office of her employer, Houston lawyer James Campbell. Mr. Campbell and his wife Virginia had been gone almost 2 weeks now, and Maria had, as always, loved the time she had spent with the couple's 2 grandsons, 8-year-old Michael and 6-year-old Matthew. Maria and the boys had both arrived at 8901 Memorial Drive at nearly the same time. That was when Cindy, one of the Campbells' 4 daughters, had come back home to her parents following a divorce. Maria let out a sigh. Her feelings towards Cindy were a lot less warm than her feelings for the rest of the Campbell family. It had all happened 10 years ago, before Maria had joined the family, but everyone knew the story. In 1972, Cindy had run off to Colorado at the age of 17, and once she was there, she met and married a man named Michael Charles Ray. But right after her 2 boys were born, Cindy wanted out of the marriage, and her father had arranged the divorce, making sure that Cindy got full and exclusive custody of her kids. But then all Cindy had done was bring the boys back to the family home on Memorial Drive and hand them over to her parents to raise. And by the time Maria had arrived to help with the house and the boys, Michael and Matthew were both calling their grandparents Mom and Dad. And Cindy was living at her parents' expense in an apartment building that was part of the Campbells' various real estate holdings in and around Houston. And when Cindy did visit, it seemed to Maria that the second to youngest Campbell daughter was much more interested in getting money from her mom and dad than she was in spending any time with her own 2 kids. As Maria herded Michael and Matthew into the kitchen to make them a nice hot breakfast, the 3 of them chatted away in Spanish. Thanks to Maria, the boys were fluent in both Spanish and English, and now that they were getting a little older, they were also doing their best to help Maria brush up on her English skills. As Maria watched them settle down at the scuffed kitchen table to eat their scrambled eggs dotted with bright jalapeno and sweet red peppers, she had to admit that it was probably better that Cindy was not actively involved in her children's lives. From her apartment over the garage, where she'd had a bird's eye view of the Campbell household for 5 years now, it had seemed to Maria that Cindy mostly seemed to create problems for other people. During the few years that Cindy was going to the same college as her younger sister Jamie, Maria had seen Cindy get into the car with Jamie in the morning to drive to school, and as soon as Jamie had started up the car and headed down the driveway to the street, Maria had seen Cindy toss burning cigarette butts into Jamie's long hair. And not only had Cindy never gotten her own driver's license, as far as Maria knew, She'd never really had a job either, not even after she had dropped out of college and had a lot of time on her hands. There had been that time, maybe a year or a year and a half ago, when Cindy had lived with a boyfriend who had helped her eat better and even go for walks and do some exercising, and Cindy had not only lost close to 60 pounds, but she'd also told her family that she'd gotten a job at a Houston nightclub doing stand-up comedy. But, like most of Cindy's so-called fresh starts, that had not amounted to much. Because now, Cindy was back to living in squalor in her own apartment again. Maria had heard what the apartment looked like: unwashed dishes, open cans of partly eaten food, dirty sheets on an unmade bed, and it looked to Maria like Cindy had given up on exercise, along with keeping herself clean and going to work. And lately, with her parents still not due back in town for another few days, Cindy had started to drop by the mansion again, getting lifts with people Maria did not know or recognize, and who just tended to sit in their car and smoke or drop an empty soda or beer can out of the car window while they waited for Cindy to come back outside. One of the reasons the Campbells had decided to go on this vacation in the first place was to get away from Cindy. In the last 6 months, Mr. Campbell especially had gotten fed up with Cindy's tantrums and requests for money, and he had told her that it was way beyond the time that she had found a job and started supporting herself. Mrs. Campbell still found it hard to say no to Cindy, but Maria knew that even Cindy's mother had finally run out of patience, and ever since her parents had turned off the money faucet, it seemed to Maria that Cindy was always in a very bad mood. Yes, Maria thought, as she and the boys all squeezed themselves onto the worn couch in the living room to watch a little TV, Maria would be very glad when Mr. and Mrs. Campbell arrived back home. It had made Maria uneasy hearing Cindy clomping through the house. Maria was a very strong and capable woman, but she had decided that she would rather not be alone at the house when Cindy stopped by for those visits. But a few nights later, on June 9th, 1982, when Maria opened the big front door of the brick and flagstone house to welcome the Campbells back home from their vacation, the housekeeper could see immediately that just stepping over the threshold back into their own home seemed to deepen the lines of worry around Virginia Campbell's intensely blue eyes. 50 years old and 5 foot 4 inches tall, Virginia's trim frame had gotten shorter over the years because of a slight curvature of her spine and the 3 decades she'd spent as a paralegal hunched over a keyboard. Now, the top of her head barely reached her husband's shoulders. But even though she was tired from all the traveling, Virginia gave Maria a warm smile. Over the years, the two women had become friends, as well as employer and housekeeper, and they had shared a bond in their love for Michael and Matthew. Maria appreciated Virginia's sense of humor, and she liked that her employer did not show off her wealth with expensive and fussy furniture. Despite its size, the inside of the Campbell's house was comfortable and plain. Mr. Campbell sometimes accepted TVs and other appliances in place of payment from his clients, and inside the living room there were 2 TVs, one stacked on top of the other. There wasn't very much that was fancy about Virginia either. She was a hard worker, she enjoyed wearing inexpensive costume jewelry, and if Maria could find one fault with her employer, it was that Virginia was maybe overly generous with everybody and maybe a little too timid when it came to speaking her mind. The same could never be said of Mr. Campbell. 6 foot 4 inches tall, 201 pounds with a strong build and dark hair and features, James Campbell, who was 55 years old, had made a name for himself as a highly skilled and successful Houston lawyer with a solo practice and a sly and unpredictable sense of humor. He was well known not just for winning cases, but for his courtroom theatrics. With his trademark Panama hat with its wide brim and his slightly rumpled suits, he was delighted when lawyers for insurance companies underestimated his ability to collect money on behalf of his clients for physical or mental or emotional injuries. He was also a devoted husband and family man. He and Virginia had met when they were both in college in Los Angeles, California, and they had been together ever since. James regularly fired difficult clients and refused huge cases that would take up too much of his time. The Campbells seldom drank or entertained, although they did have a circle of close friends that they liked to spend time with. James's only exercise was playing golf, and most of the time that he was out on the green, he was chewing one of his favorite brands of cigars. Now, even though the couple worked together in James's law office, both James and Virginia were thinking about retirement. In the last year, Virginia had had a health scare. She discovered a lump in her breast, and even though it turned out not to be cancer, it had reminded her and James that there was more to life than just the practice of the law. And even though the couple had done well for themselves financially, if they were going to retire, then they wanted to cut back on unnecessary expenditures, like continuing to support their 27-year-old daughter, Cindy. So, while their vacation was a welcome break for James and Virginia, it hadn't really done anything to solve the family's Cindy problem or change the resentment Cindy was feeling about her parents' decision to finally push her out of the nest. One look at Virginia's tired face, and Maria decided not to even mention Cindy's recent visit to the house while her parents were away. But Cindy herself had no intention of protecting her mother from worry. Instead, she seemed eager to make sure that her mother was as miserable as possible. 2 days after the Campbells had returned from their vacation, and while James was at his law office, Cindy had arrived at the mansion on Memorial Drive and yelled and screamed at her mother, demanding more money. By that afternoon, Cindy not only had more money, she was dragging her mother around Houston to buy Cindy expensive silk blouses and designer jeans. The next day, June 12th, Michael and Matthew were waiting for Maria when she came into the main house first thing in the morning. The boys cried when they told Maria about the big fight late the night before between Virginia, who they called Mom, and their biological mother, who they just called Cindy, that had occurred when Virginia gave Cindy a ride back to her apartment with all her shopping bags full of new clothes. Maria calmed the boys down as best as she could, but it was clear to Maria that Virginia Campbell was just too timid to stick up for herself. Maria wished that the other Campbell daughters lived closer so they could come by and visit and make Mr. and Mrs. Campbell and the boys smile again. On June 17th, the Campbells' youngest daughter, Jamie, who had left Houston to attend a college out in Knoxville, Tennessee, called to check in on her mom. Now that it was spring, Jamie was hoping to plan a long vacation back at home in Houston. But when Jamie mentioned this plan to her mother on the phone, Virginia just changed the subject. And more, Jamie had the feeling that her parents just wanted her to stay right where she was in Knoxville rather than come back to the family home. The next day, Friday, June 18th, was hot and humid. But the spring flowers were in bloom, and the Campbells, including Maria, were all looking forward to an evening out at Houston's Memorial City Mall. And while Virginia did look delighted as she and Maria and Matthew strolled from shop to shop, with Virginia buying small gifts for each of them, when the three of them sat down in the mall cafeteria for a bite to eat, Virginia seemed so anxious and worried that she had no appetite for food. Instead, Virginia just lit one cigarette after another, stubbing each one out after only a few puffs before ordering a Coke and then coffee. By the time they got home, around 9 p.m. that evening, James and his older grandson, Michael, had already returned from their evening out, and now James had stretched out his long legs in the living room and was watching TV. Watching as Virginia joined her husband, Maria smiled before walking upstairs to check on the two boys and get them settled for bed. Friday nights were a special treat for Michael and Matthew. That was the one night of the week when they were allowed to drag their sleeping bags and bedding into their grandparents' master bedroom for a sleepover. That involved arranging themselves at the foot of their grandparents' bed and watching a movie on a cassette tape before falling asleep. Maria glanced at her watch. It was almost 9:30 p.m. She helped the boys get comfortable in their sleeping bags at the foot of the bed, and as she kissed them goodnight, she told them that their grandfather would be up any minute to start the movie. A few minutes later, after stopping by the living room to say goodnight to James and Virginia, Maria made her way out the back door to her own apartment over the garage. As she climbed the wooden stairs and looked up at the big Texas sky, Maria shook her head, wishing there was more she could do to help Mrs. Campbell. At about 3:40 a.m. on June 19th, less than 6 hours after Maria had left the main house to return to her apartment, Maria was startled awake by the sound of small footsteps running up her outside stairs, and then the sound of small hands banging on her door. A moment later, Maria heard the frantic and terrified wails of Michael and Matthew as they begged her to let them inside. After stumbling out of her bedroom and opening the door, it took Maria another moment to understand what Michael and Matthew were telling her. As she leaned down to gather the boys into her arms, the oldest pulled on her nightgown and looked up at her, tears running down his face. And now he was practically screaming as he told Maria in Spanish that Mom and Dad, aka James and Virginia, were dead. "They just killed them! They just killed them!" the little boy kept repeating. And then, "Maria, please, call the hospital, call an ambulance." At first, Maria believed the boys, both of them, had just had a terrible nightmare, but even as she offered to make them some sugar water and sit down at the table with them, Maria saw that the boys had wet their pants. This was no bad dream, they told her. This had happened. The boys had been asleep, and then the light came on, and then there were loud noises, and then it was quiet again. And when Michael had finally crawled out of his sleeping bag, climbed to his feet, and looked onto the bed, he had seen that his grandparents, Mom and Dad, were covered in red, and they were no longer moving. Maria still could not believe it, and she didn't know enough English to tell this fantastical story to the police. So instead of calling 911, Maria told Michael to call his uncle J.W. Campbell, James Campbell's older brother, who was also a lawyer. 20 minutes later, J.W. and his wife Brucine arrived at 8901 Memorial Drive. While J.W. waited in Maria's apartment with the two boys, Brucine and Maria made their way over to the back entrance of the main house and stepped inside through the unlocked kitchen door. A minute later, and the two women were standing in the doorway of the master bedroom, and Michael and Matthew had been right. James and Virginia Campbell were dead. By 4:13 a.m., just half an hour after Maria had come suddenly awake, Houston police and medical personnel had arrived on the scene. Two men in uniform told the small group of 3 adults and 2 children, who were now huddled in the driveway, to step way back from the house. And Maria and Brucine felt a bolt of fear as they understood what the officers were really saying to them, that the killer might still be in the house. Detectives Michael St. John and his senior partner Carl Kent got the call at 4:35 a.m. A big murder out on Memorial Drive in an especially affluent area of Houston known as the Golden Buckle on the Sun Belt. 20 minutes later, the 2 homicide detectives had arrived at the Campbell home and were met in the back of the house by an officer who told them that police had searched the house and it was empty except for the 2 victims. Stepping into the downstairs rooms, Detective Kent was surprised at how plain the inside of the house was, but when he stepped into the master bedroom, any thoughts about home decor just vanished, as his mind went blank with shock. As a veteran homicide detective, Carl Kent had seen his share of gruesome murders, but this was his first cold-blooded execution. And the fact that the bodies in front of him were inside one of the safest and richest neighborhoods in Texas made him feel like he was looking at an overdone and grotesque movie set rather than real life. Everywhere he looked, there was blood. It was spattered on the ceiling, it was dripping down the walls and pictures, it was sprayed onto the curtains, and it was soaking into the sheets and mattress where James lay on his back and Virginia lay on her side. 2 tan sleeping bags lay in a heap on the floor at the foot of the bed. Detective Kent wondered if the killer had even realized that the Campbells' grandsons and potential witnesses were lying right at the shooter's feet when the shots were fired. Detective Kent left his junior partner and the crime scene techs to do their work. He had already noticed some spent shell casings in the bedroom and a plastic surgical glove in the living room that the killer may have dropped on their way out of the house. But right now, Detective Kent wanted to talk to his first person of interest, James Campbell's brother, J.W., the man Maria had told Michael to call even before calling police. The detective wanted to know why J.W., an able-bodied man, had sent Maria and Brucine into the house to check out a possible murder scene instead of going into the house himself, and why, after getting Michael's frantic call, J.W. hadn't immediately alerted the police before heading over to the Campbells' residence. And when Detective Kent eventually spoke to the Campbells' grandsons about what they had seen, the oldest said what his uncle J.W. had told him to say: "I have a right to remain silent." The detective couldn't help but wonder if J.W. had anything he was trying to hide. By late Saturday, 3 of the Campbell daughters had arrived in Houston and were gathered at Memorial Drive. As the women, the oldest, Michelle, and the youngest, Jamie, followed by the second oldest, Betty, started going through their parents' house to see if anything was missing, they quickly discovered that the police were wrong when they assumed there had been no sign of robbery. While no one had taken the gold watch and diamond ring that Virginia had been wearing, and there was no sign that the house had been ransacked, the daughters and Maria quickly discovered that the fat roll of $100 bills that Virginia had taken with her the previous day on her trip to the mall was missing. The fourth Campbell daughter, Cindy, did not show up at 8901 Memorial Drive until the following afternoon, Sunday, June 20th, a day and a half after she'd been told that her parents were dead. And when Cindy did arrive, she and the man driving her, David West, who was yet another one of her on-again, off-again boyfriends, both looked totally hungover. Investigators had already tracked down Cindy and interviewed both her and David. While police were still checking out their alibis, they both seemed pretty solid. David had driven Cindy to her parents' house at about 10 p.m. on the night of June 18th to get some money from her mom, and David had waited in the car. After that, Cindy and David spent the night going out to eat, then attending 2 different parties where they were seen by multiple witnesses before ending the night at David's house well past the time when the Campbells were murdered. And even though Detective Kent and other investigators would hear plenty of stories about the fights Cindy had with her parents over money, police could find nothing in her background or David's to suggest that they could be tied to the murder. As for the other sisters and James's brother, J.W. Campbell, it would turn out that all of them too had solid alibis. And that was the problem. From the very start of the investigation, detectives were hampered by the lack of any useful physical evidence they had collected from the crime scene. They had discovered shell casings along with silver-tipped bullets, a kind of ammunition favored by professional shooters, but there was no murder weapon. They had discovered the point of entry into the Campbell's house, a downstairs den window that had been left unlocked, and in front of the window, a sofa that Maria told them had been pushed out of its usual place under the window. Outside the window, they found footprints that looked like they belonged to a pair of men's boots, along with a few cigarette butts, and inside the house, they had found that single blue surgical glove that the killer must have dropped on their way out of the house. Today, crime techs would have been able to run DNA tests on the cigarette butts and inside of the surgical glove, but back in 1982, the only forensic tool police had were fingerprint tests, and the killer, who appeared to have worn gloves during the attack, had not left any prints at the scene. But even without any solid leads, police continued the slow process of investigating every other clue they could find. They interviewed James Campbell's clients and anyone else whose name came up as someone James had crossed in a court case. They also tracked down Cindy's ex-husband and the father of her children, Michael and Matthew, but it turned out that in addition to having an alibi himself, the boys' biological father had no interest in getting custody of the boys. The same was true of Cindy. On June 23rd, the day after her parents' funeral, Cindy had arrived at the house to take Michael and Matthew home with her. Over the objections of both Maria and the children and her sisters, Cindy had marched out with Michael and Matthew. But less than a week later, she had given up completely on parenthood. Police got a call from the DePelchin Children's Center and Adoption Agency saying that Cindy Campbell had just turned her 2 young boys over to the center. After police went to the orphanage and retrieved the children, the Campbells decided that the safest place now for Matthew and Michael was to stay in the care of their uncle, J.W., a lawyer, and his wife, Brucine. Over the next 4 months, the Houston police racked up so much overtime investigating the Campbell murder that they could only put in for half of it and still expect to get paid. They followed up on tips that the mafia might be involved. They followed tips from a prison inmate bragging about slitting the throats of some rich couple in Houston. And because Cindy's 3 sisters had zeroed in on Cindy as their prime suspect, the police did spot surveillance checks on Cindy and on David, even though the couple seemed to have broken up and gone their own separate ways. But even as the investigation slowly sputtered to a halt, the family drama among the Campbell sisters was just swinging into high gear. Cindy wanted her parents' house sold and the estate settled right away so she could get her share of her parents' money. But it turned out that most of the Campbells' wealth was tied up in real estate, not cash or stocks or bonds, and Cindy's sisters wanted to hold off on selling the house or other real estate holdings until the market improved and they could get a better price. And while investigators were eager for any new evidence, the frequent calls they were now getting from Betty and Jamie insisting that their sister, Cindy, had to be guilty of something had started to sound more and more unreliable, like detectives were just hearing the same old lines from a long-running and distorted family argument. By the end of October 1982, almost 5 months after James and Virginia were shot in their own bedroom, investigators quietly shelved the Campbell murder case. There were a lot of other homicides in the huge city of Houston that were just as important and a lot easier to solve. It wouldn't be until February 1985, more than 2 years after the murder of James and Virginia Campbell, that investigators would finally get the tip they were hoping for. And when that call came in, the story police heard was so unbelievable that not only would it make detectives yank that cold case right off the shelf, it would also put the Campbell homicide case onto the front pages of national newspapers from Washington, D.C. to Los Angeles, California. Based on that big tip and follow-up work by police, here is a reconstruction of what really happened in the early morning hours of June 19, 1982, at the Big Brick House on 8901 Memorial Drive in one of Houston's most affluent neighborhoods. At 2:30 a.m. on Saturday, June 18th, the Campbell's killer cleaned the .45 caliber pistol one more time before sliding the magazine of silver-tipped bullets inside. By 3 a.m., the killer had inspected the rest of the gear, smeared mud on the license plate of the car they'd be driving so no one could read all the numbers, and slipped on a tight-fitting pair of plastic surgical gloves. Then the killer slid behind the car's steering wheel and eased out onto the main road that led west to Memorial Drive and the Campbell house. As the killer neared the Campbell Street, they turned off their headlights and pulled their car onto the shoulder of the road on the opposite side of the hulking brick and stone house with the red tile roof. The time was 3:20 a.m. The .45 was tucked into the killer's shoulder holster, and a white hockey mask that goalies wore to protect their entire face fit snugly over the black ski mask underneath. Crossing the road to the front gate that blocked the entrance to the Campbell's property, the killer, careful not to make any noise, unwound a heavy metal chain that was wrapped, but not locked, around the latch. Stepping to the rear wall of the house, the killer found the window that looked in on the den. After easing the screen out, they began to work the window until it slid up just far enough that the killer could slip inside the house. A moment later, after pushing aside a sofa that had been under the window, the killer had crossed the den and then the living room, headed for the curved stairway to the second floor. Before placing their boots soundlessly on the first tread, the killer gently released the safety on the .45 caliber pistol in the shoulder holster. At the landing, the killer paused to listen. The big house was quiet. Turning to the upstairs hallway that was faintly lit by a nightlight plugged into an electrical outlet in the woodwork, the killer went up the last few steps to the second floor. Ignoring the closed doors on either side of the hallway ahead, the killer stopped at the first door on the right. They reached out a gloved hand and slowly turned the knob, pushing the door to the master bedroom open just an inch at a time. Stepping into the room, the killer saw that the queen-sized bed was positioned so the headboard was to the killer's right. The killer could just make out the figures of James and Virginia Campbell asleep on top of the covers. The killer slipped their hand upwards along the inside wall to the light switch. Taking a slow and steady breath, they flipped on the light and then took 2 steps forward towards the end of the bed. James rolled over onto his right side and started to bring his left arm up towards his face. The first bullet hit him in the neck. The killer immediately shifted their sights and aimed at Virginia. As the killer pulled the trigger again, Virginia moved slightly, and the first bullet grazed her upper arm. Quickly, the killer moved their weapon back to the man, and the third round struck James Campbell in his left eye. The fourth shot hit Virginia in her head. Stepping closer to the bed, the killer fired 2 more rounds, one into each of the victims' chests. Breathing hard, the killer took in the spray of blood across the headboard wall and ceiling. Then the killer looked down one more time to make sure that the Campbells were dead. All of 12 seconds had passed since the killer had switched on the light. Turning, the killer ran out of the room, down the curved stairway, through the living room, and out onto the front yard. The killer had never even noticed that upstairs in the master bedroom, inside of the heap of bedding at the foot of the bed, lay two small boys. 20 or 30 feet from the house, the killer suddenly stopped. Looking around and then swearing softly to themselves, the killer turned and went back to the house. The killer saw her at once, crouched on the living room floor in the dark, patting her hands over the rug, looking for the blue surgical glove she had dropped. Even without her black ski mask on, with her hair tucked inside of the man's hat and dressed in a man's coat and boots, it would have been hard for anyone to recognize the figure as Cindy Campbell. Sweating under the hockey mask and his hooded field jacket, David West grabbed Cindy's arm and pulled her to her feet. "Come on," he told her, "let's go." A few seconds later, they were both back inside of the car to Buffalo Bayou, a marshy body of water in Houston where they would get rid of everything that could connect them to the murders they had just committed. The plot to kill James and Virginia Campbell started to take form 2 years earlier, back in the fall of 1980. That's when a 22-year-old ex-Marine named David Duval West first met Cindy Campbell. The meeting happened totally by chance at the Student Center at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, where Cindy and her younger sister Jamie were both students. David was not a student, but he sometimes came to the Crooker Student Center to eat lunch. The two sisters were sitting there together one fall afternoon when David walked in and, recognizing Jamie as a girl he had once dated, walked over to their table to say hello. When Jamie introduced David to her older sister, Cindy, at first, David was repelled by Cindy's physical appearance. David only liked women who were slim and attractive in a very conventional way. At 5 foot 4 inches tall and weighing 180 pounds, Cindy, with her stringy brown hair and round face, could hardly have been further from David's ideal. Except that David found himself noticing how long Cindy's eyelashes were and how her hazel eyes had an exotic tilt to them. And the second time he bumped into Cindy a few weeks later, he stopped again to talk. And this time he told her that she could actually be very attractive if she just lost a little weight and tried a little harder with her appearance. A few days later, David got a call from Cindy. She asked David out on a date, and David said yes. When Cindy hung up the phone, she turned to her sister, Jamie, who was sitting in the same room with her at 8901 Memorial Drive, and Cindy said this about David, quote, "He's really gross, he looks like a pig, but you know what? He'd be easy to train." End quote. And it would turn out that Cindy was right. David was very easy to train. By the spring of 1981, Cindy had dropped out of college and had been living with David for 6 months. He'd put her on a diet and prescribed a regular regimen of exercise, and Cindy had lost 50 pounds. She still wasn't interested in getting a job, but David was so proud of how successfully he was managing Cindy's weight and appearance that he didn't mind supporting her. And now, everywhere they went, men admired Cindy. And Cindy had decided to take a gig as a stand-up comic at the bar where David worked as a bartender. But even as David congratulated himself on having created his own perfect woman, Cindy was busy drawing David into a tangled web of lies. According to Cindy, she had been relentlessly and continually abused ever since she was a child, by her parents, by her sisters, by her first husband, and by every boyfriend she had ever had. She had been hit, pinched, tripped, beaten, cut, neglected, and humiliated in every way imaginable. But according to Cindy, the worst thing that had ever happened to her was getting sexually molested by her father. For weeks and then months, Cindy talked non-stop to David about the abuse she had suffered until finally David agreed with Cindy that both her parents were such horrible human beings that they deserved to die. And when they did die, Cindy, who had been supported by James and Virginia her whole life, would no longer have to ask for money. Instead, her parents' money would simply become her money in the form of her inheritance. What David had no way of knowing was that Cindy told any person she became close to about being horribly abused. But depending on her audience, the type of abuse and the names of the abusers would change. As for her charge that her father had committed incest, she was just as likely to tell people that she herself was illegitimate and that James wasn't her father at all. Sometimes it was Michael James was supposed to have fathered, other times it was Matthew, and other times the father of both sons was her no-good ex-husband Michael Ray. The point of Cindy's stories, none of which police were ever able to substantiate, seemed to be so she could manipulate people and play on their sympathy to get money, and persuade them to take care of her and feed her and invite her into their homes. Even after Cindy left David and moved on to other boyfriends, she always popped into David's life either to rekindle their sexual relationship or ask for some kind of help, and each time she made sure she reminded him about what she claimed her father had done to her. And by early spring 1982, when James and Virginia decided it was time for their daughter Cindy to go get a job, Cindy returned to David, and when she did, it was to tell him that suddenly her father had started making inappropriate advances towards her, and Cindy wanted David to kill both James and Virginia Campbell. So, while James and Virginia began planning their trip to Europe with a return date of June 9th, David and Cindy began to plan exactly how they were going to kill them. And by the evening of June 19th, David and Cindy were ready to put their plan into action. Weeks earlier, David had picked up a Combat Commander .45 caliber pistol from one of his friends, and he'd been going to a local shooting range to brush up on the marksmanship skills he had learned in the Marines. He'd also bought jackets, coats, ski masks, and boots for himself and Cindy, so even if anyone saw them, no one would recognize them. While her parents were in Europe, Cindy started dropping by the house on Memorial Drive. Not only did she help herself to towels and food, she also began trying the downstairs windows to see which one opened with the least amount of noise and effort. On the evening of June 18th, 1 hour after Cindy's parents and Cindy's sons and Maria had all returned from their evening out on the town, David drove Cindy to her parents' house at 10 p.m. so Cindy could get some cash from her mother. But the real purpose of that visit was to unlock the window in the den, so when Cindy and David came back at 3:30 in the morning to kill Cindy's parents, they would have a way to get inside the house. After that short visit to 8901 Memorial Drive, Cindy and David carefully set up an alibi, making sure they were seen at several parties that were too big for anyone to remember exactly when they left, only that they were there. And then, at 3:20 a.m., dressed to kill, David pulled the car they were driving up onto the shoulder of the road directly across from the Campbell's mansion. And when David slid into the Campbell's house through the den window that Cindy had left unlocked, Cindy was right behind him. And it was Cindy who led David up the stairs to her parents' bedroom. And it was Cindy who flipped on the lights just before racing back downstairs, where she dropped that blue glove to wait for David. And for months after the murders, it looked like David and Cindy may have committed the perfect crime. They only had one moment of panic when they realized that Cindy's boys were actually in the Campbell's bedroom when the murders were committed and might be able to ID them. That's when Cindy dragged the children out of the Campbell home on June 23rd and took them to David's apartment, where she and David grilled the two little boys about what they had seen or heard on the night of the murders. Satisfied that the boys could not ID them, Cindy and David simply dropped the boys off at the orphanage. 6 weeks after the murders, Cindy broke up with David and started borrowing large amounts of money drawn against her expected inheritance. And at the same time, the Houston Homicide Division put the Campbell murder investigation in the cold case files. But then, 2 years and 4 months after the murders, and just before Cindy's sisters were ready to settle their parents' estate and distribute the Campbell's inheritance among the 4 daughters, Cindy's older sister, Betty, decided to make one final attempt to see if Cindy had been involved in their parents' murder. And in December of 1984, Betty hired a private detective firm called Clyde Wilson International Investigators to find out who killed James and Virginia. On the evening of Wednesday, December 19th, David West looked up from his drink at the Park Lane bar in Houston and saw just his kind of woman weaving her way towards him. Tall, athletic-looking, and plenty of curves, Teresa Neal, as she later introduced herself, was wearing high-heeled suede boots, black satin pants and jacket, and black eyeliner around her big, vivid blue eyes. 2 weeks later, and David was totally smitten with her. He was fine with the fact that Teresa wanted to keep things between them platonic, at least for now. David had always prided himself on respecting and defending women, which was really what had gotten him mixed up in Cindy's murder plot in the first place. He'd been trying to protect her from her father. But now, the crime he had committed weighed on David, and by January 4th, he had started dropping hints to Teresa that he was keeping a very big secret. And it had to do with an old girlfriend of his, a woman named Cindy Campbell. By mid-February of 1985, David and Teresa had declared their love for one another. But before Teresa could fully trust David and begin the physical relationship he wanted, he had to tell her the details of this secret he was keeping. He had to be totally honest and open with her before she could commit to him. So, on the night of February 20th, after spending the evening together and listening to David talk about Cindy Campbell's crazy tales of abuse, neglect, and incest, Teresa told him it was now or never. As they sat inside her car in the driveway of his house, Teresa's black purse on the console between them, Teresa told David that if he didn't tell her exactly what he and Cindy had done, then Teresa was going to walk out of his life forever. After a long moment of silence, David reached across the space between them, put his fingers under Teresa's chin, and turned her face so he was looking directly into her blue eyes. Then, in a quiet voice, David told Teresa, quote, "I killed both her parents," end quote. Teresa, whose real name was Kim Paris, and whose real job was working as an undercover private detective for the firm that Betty had hired to find her parents' killer, let out a long, astonished breath. In all her time working this case, it had never really occurred to the young private eye that David himself might have executed James and Virginia Campbell. Meanwhile, the tape recorder whirring away silently in the purse that sat between them picked up every word of David's confession. And so did the surveillance team in the police van around the corner, where Kim's partner was listening with two police officers. Back at the Houston police station, investigators got the call and the tip they had been waiting for. Thanks to the work done by Clyde Wilson International Investigations and 23-year-old Kim Paris, Houston police could finally close the case on the Campbell murders. Before Kim Paris left David's driveway that night, she and David agreed to meet up together the following night for dinner. And on February 21st, after that dinner, during which David gave up even more details about the murder and Cindy's involvement, Kim told David she needed to stop on their way home at a convenience store so she could buy another pack of cigarettes. When they made that stop, Kim told David to wait in the car, saying she'd be back in just a couple of minutes. As soon as she walked away, an entire team of police officers surrounded the car. When David stumbled out of the front passenger seat, he caught sight of Kim standing on the other side of the store's glass windows. As David was arrested and charged with capital murder, Kim met his eyes and raised the beer can she was now holding in a silent toast. Later that same Thursday, Houston police issued an arrest warrant for Cindy Ray Campbell. And on December 11th, 1985, David West pleaded guilty to the first-degree murders of James and Virginia Campbell. In exchange for that guilty plea, he did not face the death penalty, and he agreed to testify at trial against his one-time girlfriend, Cindy Campbell. David was immediately sentenced to life in prison. In June of 1987, Cindy was also convicted of first-degree murder and was also sentenced to life in prison. David is still incarcerated today at Ramsey Correctional Center in Brazoria County, Texas. As for Cindy, on September 13, 2021, while serving her life sentence at Mountain View Women's Prison in Gatesville, Texas, she died of natural causes. She was 65 years old. In 1974, 18-year-old Debbie Stone landed what she considered to be an amazing summer job. She was hired to work at Disneyland in Anaheim, California. Her specific role was to be a hostess at a brand new attraction called America Sings. Disney had basically converted an old carousel, which is a ride that spins around in a circle. They had converted it into a rotating stage, and they put up partition walls all along this rotating stage to create 6 distinct stages on this rotating stage. And so on each of these 6 stages were different sets of these robotic animals that played different songs about America. And so the way this would work if you were in the audience is you would walk into this theater that looked like a single theater with one stage right in front of you, but really what you were looking at is one of the 6 stages. And so the audience would sit down, they would see one of the acts, they'd see one performance on one of the stages, and then the stage would rotate. And so the audience would remain in the theater until all 6 stages had rotated in front of them and played their 2 to 4 minute long act. Debbie's job at America Sings was at the beginning of these shows where the audience would watch all 6 acts. She would go up before the very first act, she'd go on stage and she would greet the audience. And then the show would start, it would filter through all 6 of the stages, and then Debbie would get back on stage and she would say goodbye to that group of audience members. It was a simple gig and Debbie seemed to like it. And so on July 9th of that year, which was 9 days after this attraction had opened, and so it was 9 days after Debbie had started her job, Debbie was asked to come in for an evening shift. And so she left her house and she made it out to the attraction at about 10 p.m., which was right at the start of a show. And so she went right inside, she hopped on stage, she greeted the audience, and then she left the stage and the show began. And so over the next 30 minutes, all 6 of the stages performed their acts. And then after the 6th act was done, Debbie dutifully climbed back onto the stage. She said goodbye to the audience. And then as that audience was leaving the theater, she turned around and walked towards the back of the stage she was on. What happened next requires some additional explanation. Each of the 6 stages that made up this attraction had a fairly tall back wall. And behind each of these 6 back walls that were kind of in a ring was the center of the actual attraction. And in the center was this circular, fairly tall storage room. This storage room did not rotate. It was stationary. The stages and their respective back walls, they rotated around this storage room. And the gap between the outside of the storage room and the back of any of these back walls was only a few inches. It was very narrow, but it was big enough that a person, in theory, could get stuck back there. So it was a real hazard. However, Disney did not put any specific safeguards in place to prevent their staff from intentionally or unintentionally going into this space. They just told their staff to not go back there and be careful. So back on July 9th, after Debbie has said goodbye to the audience and she's walked towards the back of the stage she's on, she decides to move from the stage she's on to the adjoining stage. And when she does that, she either trips or falls or something happens, which causes her to fall into the narrow space between the 2 back walls of the 2 stages she was on. And so she falls through that gap and then gets wedged between the outside of the storage room and the back of one of the back walls. She tries to pull herself up and pull herself out of the space, but she realizes she's stuck. And so she starts to panic and she starts screaming for help. None of the staff hear her, or they don't recognize that this is a real call for help. And this new wave of people that are coming in, the new audience, they're all talking loudly, there's music playing, they don't really hear her. And anyone that actually did hear her calling for help, they would later say they thought it was part of the show. And so as Debbie is screaming bloody murder, she cannot get out of this gap, this narrow gap she's stuck in. These stages, they start to move because the show is going to start. And because Debbie has nowhere to go, when the stage began to rotate, she got forcibly dragged and twisted and rolled, and her body began to contort, and bones started to break, and she was forced to continue moving through this narrow space because the stage was just going to keep on going until it reached its next position. And so finally, after it dragged her all the way to its next position, Debbie didn't die. She was grievously injured. She probably had dozens of broken bones, but she was alive and she's still totally stuck and she's screaming with every ounce of energy she has. But again, the audience, even though they heard her screaming, they assumed it was part of the show. And apparently the staff also heard her screams and convinced themselves it was just no big deal. And so 2 to 4 minutes later, when the act was complete, the stage began to rotate again. And so Debbie again is rolled and contorted and crushed and dragged and smashed and broken as the stage again rotates to its next position. And she's still not dead. She's screaming out for help. No one is coming to help her. And so the entire show would play out, with with the stage rotating through all of its sections. And then finally, at the end of the show, when one of the audience members alerted the staff that, hey, you should really go check out that screaming we heard. And at that point, they went for a look and they discovered Debbie, and she was very obviously deceased. Disney would pay a small settlement to Debbie's family, and then they would put up a number of safeguards on the America Sings attraction to make sure something like this never happened again. The next story, which is our number 2 story on today's list, is called Water Closet. On Saturday, September 30th, 2017, a staff member at a North Wales country club noticed water leaking out of the bottom of an outside wall of one of their many bungalows. These bungalows, which were generally just vacation rentals, were single-story white structures situated up on this beautiful green hillside. The staff member, after seeing this leak, they just turn around and go back to the front office and they tell their boss about it. And then shortly after, 2 maintenance workers were sent out to check on this leak. And so these 2 workers, they go over to this bungalow and they knock on the front door. But after a while, when no one comes to the door, they pull out their master key and they begin to turn the lock. And as they do that, they yell out just in case, hey, we're here just to check on a leak. We have to come in. It's a potential emergency. And so they open up the door, they swing it open, and no one comes to the door. It's still silent. And they're looking into this property. And what they see is on the left, from their perspective, is a kitchen. And on their right is a living room. It was basically one big room that had been designated for 2 distinct functions. And so they yelled out again into this bungalow, hey, we're coming inside, we're just checking on this leak. And then they just walked straight across past the living room and past the kitchen to the back of this property where they reached a door. And this door led into a bedroom, and this door was shut. And so just as a precaution, they knocked on the bedroom door, but nobody came to the door again. So they opened up the bedroom door and they looked into this room. And on the right side of the room, tucked up against the right wall, were 2 twin beds where the head of each bed was tucked up against the wall. And then in the middle of the room, at the base of these 2 beds, was a pile of unopened luggage. And so to the 2 maintenance workers, this told them that someone clearly was staying in this bungalow. Either they had just arrived or they were getting ready to leave, but apparently they were not there right now. And so the workers walked around the luggage and around the 2 beds. So they walked on the left side of the room all the way to the back where there was another closed door, and it went into the bathroom. And based on where the leak had been coming out of the structure, they believed it would be coming from this particular bathroom. And so again, they get up to this door and they knock on it because, they want to make sure no one's in there, but there's more silence. And so they open up the bathroom and right away they see water all over the bathroom floor. But as they scan around the bathroom, they look at the sink, they look at the shower, the toilet, none of them are overflowing or running. So it was not any of the usual suspects that had caused this leak. However, there was one other area in the bathroom that could have caused a water leak, and that was the airing cupboard. An airing cupboard is typically where you keep a hot water heater. It's basically like a walk-in closet where the majority of the space is taken up by this heater. And also generally people put in shelves in front of the heater to store their linens and towels and that sort of thing. And in this bungalow, the airing cupboard had its own door and it was right in the bathroom. And this door to the airing cupboard was right to the left of the door that led into the bathroom from the bedroom. And so these 2 workers, they reached over and they opened the door that led into this airing cupboard. And as soon as it swung in, they could tell right away where the leak was coming from. And they could tell right away they had a much, much bigger problem. 7 days earlier, 60-year-old former policewoman Mary Isherwood arrived at the North Wales Country Club. She and her ex-husband had for a long time owned one of these bungalows. However, they almost never stayed in it. They basically used it as an income property, renting it out to vacation goers. But they had recently decided that they wanted to actually sell the property. And so before the sale became final, Mary had told her ex-husband that she just wanted to go and spend a week actually enjoying the property and actually take a vacation there. And so originally she and some friends were going to go to this bungalow and spend a week there. But right before they were going to leave, Mary's friends all said they couldn't make it. And so Mary decided she would just go on her own. And so Mary arrives at this country club. It's late at night when she gets there. She gets to the bungalow. She puts her luggage down in her bedroom. And then instead of just kind of getting settled in and going to sleep, she decides she's going to go exercise. Mary was incredibly fit and healthy. She loved playing golf and running and exercising in general. And she knew the club had a pool. And so she reached into her luggage and she just pulled out a bathing suit. She switched into that, and then she went down to the pool and did some lap swimming. After that, she came back to her room where she took a shower, and then she climbed in bed without any clothes on. That was just how Mary liked to sleep. And then at some point in the middle of the night, Mary woke up to go use the bathroom. And so she hopped out of her twin bed. She walked around to the door that led into the bathroom. She went inside, she did her business. And then afterwards, as she was attempting to go back into her bedroom, she accidentally grabbed the door handle of the airing cupboard, which was right to the left of the door leading back to her bedroom. She opened it up, it swung inward. She stepped into the airing cupboard, which was totally pitch black. And as she walked in, she might have bumped into the shelves or realized, this was the wrong turn. But as soon as this happened, the door behind her had actually shut. And so she's inside of this tiny airing cupboard, realizing, okay, this is not where I need to go. I've made a silly mistake. She turned around to grab the door handle to open the airing cupboard back up again. But when she grabbed the knob, it disintegrated in her hands. It broke into multiple parts and fell to the ground. Now, the space she is in is pitch black. She has no way of knowing which parts go where for this doorknob. And so by touch, she reached down and she grabbed all these pieces, and she probably tried to put them together and put it back on this door to try to get it open, but she just couldn't do it. And so eventually, Mary would have realized this is a pretty serious situation. She was staying at this bungalow by herself, and she was not expected to check out for another week. So no one was going to be checking on her. And without this doorknob, she could not open this closet door. It was a hard wooden door. The locking mechanism was solid. There was just no way to open it without this doorknob. And so Mary began banging on the door and screaming out for help. But her bungalow was not actually connected to any other structures. It was a standalone. And so her voice did not carry very far. And the banging sounds she was making, those also did not carry very far. And so no one heard her. And so after several hours, she's just standing in this closet, probably thinking to herself, how in the world did I get myself in this position? But after the initial shock of this totally bizarre situation she was in had worn off, she decided to act. And so she turned away from the door and she faced towards the back of this closet. She would have been face to face with a row of shelves, but she wouldn't have been able to see the shelves because it was totally dark. And then beyond the shelves, farther into this closet, was the actual hot water heater. There was no wall behind the shelves. Basically, there was a space behind the shelves where this heater was. And so Mary grabbed one of these shelves and she managed to break it off the wall. And then she turned around and used this piece of wood and tried to smash the door, but very quickly realized that was just going to do nothing. However, she began striking the wall right next to the door, and she realized she could break through the drywall. She was starting to kind of burrow a hole. And so maybe she thought to herself, if I can just build a hole big enough right next to the door, I can reach through the hole and maybe open this cupboard from the outside. And so she began using the shelf to smash this wall, and she's burrowing as fast as she can. But the progress must have been very, very slow because she decides she needs a different tool. So she turns back around, so she's facing the shelves again, and she breaks down a few more shelves to clear a path to get to the water heater. And then once she could step past the shelves, once there was a path, she got right in front of this water heater, and then by touch began feeling around for any pipes extending off of the heater. Then when she found one, she got a good grip of it, and she began yanking and tugging on it until she managed to rip a piece of pipe off of the hot water heater. Now, as soon as she did that, she now had a pipe that was a far better tool for burrowing and creating this hole in the wall. However, as soon as that pipe broke off, cold water began leaking out of this hot water heater, the water that had not been heated yet, and it was being sprayed all over the inside of this cupboard. Now, this was a very small space, and so there was no way for Mary to get out from under this cold water. And so it was a shocking and probably very painful experience, but she now had her tool and figured, okay, this is awful, but I'll just use this tool, I'll burrow this hole, I'll get this cupboard open, and I'll get out of here. And so with the water raining down on her, Mary used her new piece of pipe and began digging and burrowing at that spot right next to the door. But after a while, probably several hours, she struck a brick wall. There was no way she could actually push through this wall and reach around and open the cupboard door. There was nothing she could do. It was a dead end. And so totally devastated and probably very exhausted from all the energy she used to burrow this hole, she stopped. She's still getting rained down on by all this freezing cold water. And instead of just totally giving up, she just turned and faced the wall that was leading into her bedroom. She began digging again, using this tool all over again to now dig a new hole on this other wall, most likely hoping that she could literally burrow a hole big enough that she could actually crawl through into her bedroom and escape. And so after several more hours of digging as fast and as hard as she could, while also periodically banging on the door and screaming out for help, she did eventually push through into her bedroom. However, in a cruel twist of fate, when she did finally poke through this wall, there was no bricks in the way, she hit what felt like another dead end. But in fact, what it was a picture frame with a glass cover across it had been screwed onto the wall in her bedroom. And this painting was right over where she was digging this hole. And so in her totally exhausted and panicked and saddened and scared state, she hits the back of this painting, and again, it's pitch black, and she's feeling through the hole most likely, and she's touching this hard back of this painting, and she's realizing, oh my goodness, I've hit another dead end. There's nowhere for me to go. Even though, in reality, she could have very easily just broken through that frame and then maybe made the hole a little bit bigger, and then she could have squeezed through it and escaped. But she didn't know that, and so she eventually just slouched to the ground and accepted her fate. 6 days later, when those two maintenance workers opened the airing cupboard door, they found Mary's body slumped up against the wall inside this closet. She had died of hypothermia. It would turn out other residents of the other bungalows nearby heard banging coming from this bungalow on Saturday night, the night that Mary actually got stuck, and then they also heard the banging the following morning, on Sunday morning. But none of the other residents reported it because they believed it was just construction or some other maintenance work. However, there was one couple staying in one of the nearby bungalows that thought there was something off about this banging, and they told each other if the banging persists past 5 p.m. on Sunday, so that's the day after Mary got stuck, this couple told each other that if it continues past 5 p.m., we'll report it. But as it happened, Mary stopped banging on the walls and yelling for help right around 5 p.m. on Sunday. And so this couple, right as they're getting ready to go tell the front desk, the banging stopped, and so they stopped worrying about it. It's unclear how long Mary survived after she stopped banging around 5 p.m. on Sunday. It could have been minutes, it could have been hours, it could have been days. Mary's family would ultimately sue the country club for negligence. However, the outcomes of this case have not been made public. The next and final story, which is the top story of today's list, is called The Maze. In 2017, 71-year-old Bernard Gore was a retiree living in Tasmania, which is an island state of Australia. In January of that year, he and his wife of 50 years, Angela, decided to go visit their daughter who lived in Sydney, Australia. Now, they made this trip with some regularity, and they developed a sort of routine for every time they visited. They would land in Sydney, and then the first day they would spend it entirely with their daughter at her house. And then the next day, Angela would get up early, and she would head out into town and do some shopping on her own. And then sometime in the afternoon, Bernard would head out, and he would meet up with her for lunch at a very popular spot. It was called the Westfield Centre Mall, and they had an amazing food court. So on January 5th of that year, Bernard and Angela, they land in Sydney, and like they always did, they went straight to their daughter's house and they spent the day with her. And then early the next morning, Angela got up and she headed out to do her shopping. And before she left, she confirmed with her husband that they would meet up for lunch at Westfield Centre Mall. Now, as it happened, that day, Angela actually chose to do her shopping at Westfield Center Mall, and so she was there around lunchtime when she was supposed to meet Bernard. And so when she looked at her watch and she realized it was time to meet him, she just simply stepped out of the shop she was in and headed over to the food court. And when she got there, she found their meeting spot. It was in front of one of their favorite restaurants. And she sat down and then she scanned around looking for her husband. But inside of this busy food court, she couldn't see him. And so she looked at her watch again and she realized she was a couple of minutes early. And so she grabbed a menu and she began looking for what she was going to order while she waited for him to show up. But 15 minutes would go by and Bernard would not show up. And so now he was late. And so Angela, at this point, she pulls her phone out and she tries calling her husband, but he didn't answer. However, that was kind of common for Bernard, so not necessarily a red flag. Angela would continue to try calling her husband for the next several minutes, and each time he would not answer. And so eventually Angela just gets frustrated and she's thinking to herself, maybe he just got sidetracked and he's walking around the mall somewhere, because Bernard was known for being a big window shopper. And as soon as Angela thought that, she was like, that's got to be it. And it was so frustrating for her that he had just totally blown off their lunch date. And so she stands up, she abandons her table, she's totally annoyed, and she heads out into the main shopping area to go find her husband. And so she's walking along, looking in each of the windows, expecting to see her husband. And at the same time, she's looking over her shoulder back towards the food court to see if maybe Bernard had shown up. But after 30 minutes of wandering around kind of right near the food court and not seeing him anywhere, Angela thinks to herself, you know what? I bet he thought we were supposed to meet at our daughter's house first. And so he probably hasn't even left the house yet. I bet he's just there waiting for me. And so Angela, when she realizes this, she stops looking for him in the mall. She turns around and she begins walking towards the mall exit. But before she reaches the exit door, a terrifying thought crosses her mind. What if Bernard got confused and has no idea where he is right now? A recent unfortunate development for Bernard was that he was showing early signs of dementia. It hadn't fully taken a hold of him yet, but he was clearly starting to forget things that he shouldn't. And so as soon as Angela thought of this, she went from being annoyed with her husband to being very worried about her husband. And so she sped through those doors outside and speed walked all the way back to her daughter's house, which was not far from the mall. And the whole time she's walking, she's telling herself she's going to walk inside and she's going to see Bernard. He's going to be in the house. But when she got to the house and went inside and saw her daughter said, no, Dad left about 2 hours ago to go meet you. I haven't seen or heard from him since. Now, of course, both of them were extremely worried for Bernard, but they decided to just stay calm, that the best thing they could do right now would just be to stay put, stay at their daughter's house and wait for Bernard to eventually come back, because the only other logical place he would go would be his daughter's house. And so they sat at the house just kind of waiting, looking at the door, waiting for him to come in, but he didn't. And by 8 p.m., 6 hours after anybody had last seen Bernard, he still had not shown up. They couldn't get in touch with him, and so Angela called the police and reported him missing. Immediately, the police contacted the Westfield Center Mall security team and said, hey, we're looking for this guy. And they went right down to the food court where Bernard and Angela had said they were going to meet. And the mall security team walked all around and they walked into all the nearby shops and kind of scanned the immediate vicinity near their meeting spot. But they reported back to police that there was no sign of Bernard. And they would also tell police that after reviewing their camera footage, and this mall had hundreds of cameras covering every angle, inside and out. I mean, everything is covered. They would tell police, after reviewing the footage, we didn't see Bernard enter or exit the mall at any point today. He was not here. And so the police, they take this information and they go back to Angela that night and they say, hey, look, we talked to the mall and based on their security footage, they have no record of Bernard ever being in the mall. Do you have any idea where he could have gone? And Angela would say, no, the only places would have been the mall or maybe at our daughter's house. This is also when Angela explained to police that her husband had early signs of dementia, and so it was possible that he might have just gotten confused and he could be out on the street somewhere. But she assured the police that her husband, whenever this happened, whenever he got confused, he would just sit down and he would try to ask for help from anybody passing by, or he would just sit where he was and he would wait for his family to come find him. And so with this knowledge, the police went back out and they widened their search and they began looking in all the areas that were within walking distance of the Westfield Center Mall. At the same time, Angela and her daughter began trying to retrace Bernard's footsteps from the daughter's home in the direction of the Westfield Center Mall to see if maybe there was something obvious along the route that might have sidetracked him and kind of led him astray, and that maybe he'd be somewhere else in those directions. But as they were walking around, there really was nothing that stood out to them. And then eventually it just got too dark out and they had to just turn it in and go back to their house and hope that the next morning when they got up, the police would have found Bernard and that he was okay. But the next morning when they got up, the police had not found Bernard. There was no sign of him. There was no clues, nothing. And unfortunately, over the next several weeks, there was no sign of Bernard. Nobody knew what happened to him. On January 27th, so 3 weeks after Bernard had gone missing, a maintenance worker at the Westfield Center Mall was walking down the staff-only passageway. It was basically like this tunnel with no windows, all concrete. They kind of looped around the outside of the mall to help workers get to and from certain locations in the building. He's walking down this passageway when he looks down this one hallway that was very rarely used, and he sees at the end of it, barely lit up from the lights inside, there looks to be some equipment kind of propped up against the wall. And he's thinking to himself, there's no reason someone would leave their equipment at the end of this very rarely used hallway. It didn't make any sense. And so he decided to walk down and see whose equipment it was. And so he's making his way down and he's getting closer and closer, and he still can't quite figure out what it is. The lighting's not great, but when he gets close enough to see what it is, he stops where he is, he turns around, and he runs back down the hallway. He finds the nearest exit, he goes outside, and he calls the police. Back on January 6th, on the day that Bernard and Angela were supposed to meet up for lunch, Bernard did leave his daughter's house and he walked straight to the mall, and he got there. He arrived at the Westfield Center Mall and was picked up on camera walking into their food court. But the staff at the mall who reviewed the footage for police, they only looked at a handful of cameras. There's hundreds of cameras. They only looked at a couple, and so they missed this crucial footage of Bernard. And what the footage would have shown them was Bernard making his way into the food court ahead of Angela. Angela's nowhere to be found. And Bernard, instead of sitting down at their meeting spot in front of this restaurant, Bernard suddenly looks like he's confused, and he turns and he walks to this emergency exit door. He presses it in, he steps inside, and the door shuts behind him. Now, the Westfield Center Mall is not your average mall. It is massive. There are 6 floors to it, nearly 300 shops and restaurants, but what truly makes it massive is something that the public doesn't usually see. And that is, behind staff-only doors and emergency exit doors like the one Bernard had just gone through, are nearly 8 miles of windowless concrete narrow stairwells and tunnels that loop all around the outside of the building. And once Bernard had gone through that emergency exit door and that door had shut and locked behind him, the only way for him to return to the food court and meet his wife would be if he completely exited the mall and looped all the way back around. But in order to exit the mall from where he just entered, he would need to go to a very specific exterior fire exit door that was several floors below him, and to get to it required following this very confusing signage on the walls. And so if you did it correctly, you would basically go down the hallway, find this particular stairwell, you'd go down a couple of levels, and then at some point, without really any signage, you would get to the appropriate floor and you'd go down the hallway into this maze of more hallways, and then finally you'd reach this kind of nondescript exit door, and that would be your exit. Finding your way from where Bernard entered all the way to the exit of the mall would be challenging for someone thinking clearly, and clearly Bernard was not. Bernard was confused and likely really didn't understand where he was or what he was doing or why he was there, and so he did not follow these directions. Instead, he just began wandering down the hallway, and he would have immediately passed the one stairwell that would have very circuitously brought him down but out of the building. He passed that stairwell and he just kept on walking, and eventually he walked into this staff-only area, which was even more confusing because there was no signs telling him where to go, and virtually every door he encountered would have been locked. And so as Bernard wandered through this concrete maze and got more and more mixed up and confused, he most likely began yelling out for help. But his sound could not have penetrated the walls, which means the only people who could have heard his cries would have been people inside the hallway with him. And unfortunately, this section of tunnels that Bernard had found himself in was rarely, if ever, used by any of the staff. And to make matters worse, the mall security guards were supposed to come in and do regular checks of all these 8 miles of tunnels and stairwells, specifically to see if people got lost in them. But over time, the security guards kind of stopped doing that. And there were no security cameras inside of this particular segment of tunnels that Bernard found himself in, and there was no cell phone reception, so had he tried calling anyone, it wouldn't have worked. And so truly, Bernard was on his own. And so after several hours or days of Bernard aimlessly wandering around this maze, hitting dead end after dead end and reaching locked door after locked door, Bernard at some point turned a corner and looked down at the end of a hallway, and he saw there was a chair up against the side of the wall. And like he was programmed to do anytime he got confused, he rushed over to it and he sat down and he began waiting for a passerby to help him or his family to find him. But unfortunately, help never came, and he would eventually pass away on that chair. On January 27th, that maintenance worker, he discovered Bernard's body. Following his death, the Westfield Center Mall came out and said they made drastic changes to their security system and how they track people while they're on their property. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to do the 5-star review button's eyeliner, but use a wide tip black Sharpie. Also, please subscribe to the Mr. Ballin podcast on Amazon Music, because starting November 1st of this year, 2022, our podcast is only going to be available on Amazon Music. However, from now until November 1st, you can still get the podcast on all platforms: YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google, everywhere. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. We now have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the Mr. Ballin Foundation that makes it as easy as possible for you to join me, my family, and my team in supporting those whose lives have